Hello, everyone. Welcome to our advocacy webinar focused on the Maine legislative process. We hope it will give you a broad overview of the activities, schedules, and processes at the State House in Augusta, as well as how our and your advocacy efforts leverage and align with those processes. Just a reminder, this is part of a webinar series produced by the Democracy Partnership, which represents a collaboration of two organizations, the Maine Citizens for Clean Elections and the League of Women Voters of Maine. Our agenda for today will include presentations by two panelists who you'll hear a little bit about in just a moment, as well as a Q&A at the end of this, so stay tuned for that. Your panelists today are John Brautigam and Bob Howe. John is an attorney and consultant with over 25 years of experience in campaign finance and election law, public policy, advocacy, and legal representation. From 2004 to 2008, he served in the Maine Legislature, and prior to his tenure in the Legislature, Mr. Brautigam served as Assistant Attorney General. He previously served as legal counsel, successfully defending the constitutionality of the 96 reforms to Maine campaign finance laws, including the Maine Clean Election Act. Mr. Brautigam holds a law degree from Stanford Law School. Bob Howe has been principal at Howe, Cahill and Company since 1986 and has represented Maine Citizens for Clean Elections for over 12 years. Bob served as a member of the Maine House of Representatives from 1976 to 1980 and earned a master's degree in public administration at Harvard's JFK School of Government. And my name is Dina Libner. I'm Communications Director at Maine Citizens for Clean Elections and League of Women Voters of Maine. You probably received some emails from me. Now I'll let John and Bob begin their presentation.
Thank you, Dina, and it's a pleasure to be here. This is John Brautigam, and I'm going to take the first few slides, and Bob and I are going to alternate back and forth to try to keep it interesting for you. We're very glad that you're with us today, and we'll try to move this right along and get done within an hour or so. So why is your involvement critical? At the League of Women Voters and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, the Democracy Partnership, we understand that even in the best of times, the people are the stewards of our own democracy, and we have a responsibility and an opportunity to get involved in all kinds of ways, especially now when a lot of people believe that our democracy is ailing and needs your involvement to help make sure that we continue to improve our democracy and enact the policies that the people care about. So we have an agenda of reforms that are about democracy, and therefore it is really appropriate and critical that those reforms be brought about through a democratic process involving lots of people communicating their views to their elected officials, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And I think it's rewarding. I think you can make a big difference in a state like Maine by taking your democratic involvement from simply voting or maybe an occasional letter to the editor to a higher level of involvement by actually getting involved in the legislative process, understanding the process, and trying to make a difference up in Augusta. So next slide. The structure of the legislature, as you know, we'll start out talking about just the basics of the structure of the legislature and the sessions that the legislature convenes in. Right now, we're about to begin what's called the long session. The odd-numbered years have a legislative session that runs from January to June, and it is a full session with a very busy calendar with the consideration of all kinds of different pieces of legislation, including the state budget. So anything can come up during the long session. The short session is the even-numbered year, the election year. It starts in January and usually runs until April, and it's technically reserved for emergency legislation and bills that have been carried over from the previous year. So it is not as much, quite as intensive, but it still seems to stretch on for quite a while. The legislature is usually in session on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the start of the long session, and then by June, the legislature will actually be in session every day of the week. And a critical part of the legislative structure is the committee structure, which we'll talk about in a minute. This slide shows the basics. The 129th Maine Legislature consists of a House and Senate. There are 89 Democrats in the House, 57 Republicans, and 5 who are not enrolled in either party, for a total of 151. And in the Senate, there are 21 Democrats and 14 Republicans. So Democrats are in the majority in both chambers of the legislature, and that's important for reasons that Bob will explain in a moment.
Thank you, John. That's a great introduction. It looks like we now have 64 of you out there. I think it's wonderful there's this much interest in the legislative process and how folks can get involved. One of the duties of legislators is to pick their own members of leadership and then also to select what are usually referred to as the constitutional officers. The slide you're looking at on the left shows the 2 presiding officers. The presiding officer in the Senate is referred to as the President of the Senate, and the presiding officer in the House is the Speaker of the House. We're actually missing one of the icons on the right, and that would be the State Treasurer. The state constitution specifies 3 what are usually referred to as constitutional officers: the Attorney General, and as you probably know, the incumbent Attorney General will soon become the Governor, Janet Mills; the Secretary of State, whose responsibility is quite broad and includes motor vehicle registrations, driver's licenses. It includes the election laws. It includes a lot of functions related to business entities, their registration and so forth. And the State Treasurer is the 3rd constitutional officer. The State Auditor is also a position selected by the legislature, but it's not found in the Constitution. The State Treasurer is responsible for the primary duty is to oversee the state's investments and issuance of bonds. The auditor makes sure the state's books are in order and also has some responsibility with respect to auditing state and, county and local government. All right, I think we can go to the next one. About 1/3 of the legislature turns over with every new election, and that's been the case even before term limits. The term limits has increased that number somewhat. What term limits mostly did was to see to it that there wasn't a significant number of people who served for many, many years, although that hasn't worked out quite as the drafters of it intended, because you have people like former Speaker of the House, John Martin, who has actually managed to come back either in the House or the Senate for many years since term limits were introduced. The new legislators will be sworn in this week, and they will also select those officers that we looked at on the previous slide. Governor-elect Janet Mills will be inaugurated on the 2nd of January, and legislators will have a deadline by which they need to file bills. At this point, the rules would have that as the 4th Friday in December, but the new members of leadership will meet Thursday of this week and could change that rule because that's set by what's called a joint rule of the legislature. All right, next one. The legislature does the bulk of its work in committees, which have various jurisdictions that are described reasonably well by the titles of those committees. These are what are called joint standing committees. They're joint because, unlike in some states, the committees include members of both bodies, the House and the Senate. 10 from the House, 3 from the Senate, and they're standing because they're permanent committees. Sometimes we will see what are called select committees, which are usually set up for a shorter duration to deal with a particular issue or problem, and there's been one recently on the opioid crisis. There was another one set up to deal with medical and recreational marijuana laws.
So now we'll talk about the process itself, the process by which an idea becomes a law. We have a citizen legislature in Maine, and in that process, the legislators are not experts. They deal with a lot of technical issues. They deal with a lot of emotional issues. And the citizen legislature depends on the input from citizens in the process of various ways, which we will talk about. But it is too important a process to leave it to the professional lobbyists to influence the process. The legislators need to hear from their constituents, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about in a moment. So here's a pop quiz: where does legislation come from? The possible answers: legislators, the governor, state agencies, members of the public. There could even be other possible answers there. And the answer is, of course, all of the above, although only a legislator can actually draft and sponsor a bill, actually put it in the legislative hopper, start the process. The ideas for the legislation can be from the public, agencies, really anywhere. Someone can communicate an idea to a receptive legislator and get the process going. One legislator is a sponsor, there's one co-sponsor, and there are up to 9 there's one lead co-sponsor, and there's up to 9 other co-sponsors on each bill.
Oh, my turn. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about, as the slide says, how the sausage is made. We'll start with the bill being submitted per the process John just described. Someone submitting a bill has to include a title and enough of a description so that one of the professional nonpartisan offices of the legislature, the staff there, can draft it, and that office is called the Office of the Reviser of Statutes. I, as a lobbyist, happen to prefer to submit bills fully drafted, so I have more control over how they're written and that they do what I or my client wants them to do. But even in that case, the Office of the Reviser of Statutes will have the final word on format and not content, but how the content is presented. Once the Office of Reviser of Statutes has done their work, they will send a note to the sponsor of the bill to say your bill is ready to sign. And assuming the sponsor still wants to go ahead with it, the sponsor will sign it and get some co-sponsors up to 9 in number. It goes back to the reviser and they give it a number and it's printed. And at that point, for the first time, the bill becomes public. Until that point, the only person who can release information about the bill is the sponsor, although we do get a list of titles earlier on. Once the bill is printed, it is referred to a committee. It has to be referred in both the House and the Senate, and occasionally you will see some initial disagreement, but eventually a bill will be sent to a committee. That committee will schedule it for public hearing, which in Maine is required of every bill except in the most extraordinary of circumstances, and that's not true in every state, nor is it true in Congress. Following the public hearing, which is for the purpose described in the name of the event, it is to hear from the public, and legislators get to ask members of the public questions, and there's a particular format for how hearings are conducted. Following the hearing, there'll be at least one work session. It is typically not, but sometimes is on the same day as the public hearing. Sometimes there will be multiple work sessions. And at whatever turns out to be the final work session, the committee will take a vote. I thought we had a slide, and we may later on, about what the options are for a committee. So I'll hold off on that now because that's really getting into the weeds. Once a bill leaves committee, it goes back to the House of Origin. That means the body in which its primary sponsor sits. So if it's a House member, it's a House paper. If it's a Senate primary sponsor, it's a Senate paper, and it goes to the body where the primary sponsor sits. It is given first reading and then second reading, at which time a bill could be amended on the floor. It is debated then, and then if it's not defeated at that point, it'll be sent down to the other body, the other chamber, goes through a similar process, and if it's finally passed in identical form in both houses, it goes to the governor for signature. Now, this is a very simple, this is the most simple process a bill can go through. It sometimes gets much more complicated than this, going back and forth in different versions until either the two houses agree on something, or if they, in the end, cannot agree on exactly the same version, the bill dies. I also didn't say anything at that point about the governor's options, but he can sign a bill, he can veto it where it gets sent back to see whether the legislature will override it, or he can let it become law without his signature. And will soon be able to say she. John talked a bit about the sessions of the legislature, but if you go back far enough in Maine history, the legislature met only once every 2 years. In the horse and buggy days, when the roads are too muddy in the spring to get to Augusta easily. But then the state business began to get more complicated, and we began to have what were called emergency sessions in the, that would be in the even numbered years. But it got to the point where these second sessions were happening every other year, and they regularized them. And the dates of those sessions are as you see there. Veto Day is a day in which the governor, the legislature takes up any vetoes that the governor has sent back to them. And so that typically, that date is usually 10 or more days after the legislature has ended its normal session. The special session is when either the legislature calls itself back into session or the governor does for some purpose, such as ratifying a contract with state workers or a supplemental budget that cannot wait until the next January, or it could be any number of other matters that would warrant a special session.
Let me just pause here and say that this process is something that can be quite complicated, and at the end of 4 years in the legislature, I still was not all that clear on certain parts of it. So don't worry if you're not getting all of this down. We will give you our contact information at the end of the webinar, and you can reach out to us, and we will try to provide you with answers or additional materials later on to help you navigate this once you decide that you will engage with the legislature in the months ahead. So next slide.
You want to talk about the citizen? You want to talk about the citizen lobbyist, or keep going?
Well, we will. We can talk about. I'll talk briefly about the citizen lobbyists. Each person who would like to go to the legislature and weigh in would be considered a citizen lobbyist. And you can, you don't need any permission, you don't need to register if you're a volunteer. The State House is open to you, the public hearings are open to you, the proceedings are all public proceedings, and they are open to you as a citizen lobbyist. It would be helpful to have some familiarity with what you're getting involved in to be more effective, but you don't need to register or get too formal about it in any particular way. Now, professional lobbyists do have to register, and they do have to report what they are paid, and they do have to report the bills that they're working on and so forth. But if you're not getting paid, if you're just volunteering, that does not apply to you. So next slide, please. So these are the principal committees that the Democracy Partnership partners follow and have been following for many, many years. The Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee is the committee with jurisdiction over the Clean Election Act. campaign finance, other campaign transparency laws, disclosure laws, election-related laws, and a host of other matters that are not quite as related to our mission. But
John, if
yeah.
I jump in, I like to refer to that committee as dealing with booze, ballots, and bingo. They deal with the liquor laws, the election laws, and gambling.
And gaming. Yeah. Well, sometimes you will wait for a public hearing on a clean election matter, and you'll have some interesting public hearings ahead of you. You may learn a few things while we're up there waiting for your turn. The Appropriations and Financial Affairs Committee is regarded to be the most important committee in the legislature in some ways. It controls the budget and state spending, and almost every agency and every issue has some connection with the budget, and the AFA committee we refer to will weigh in on the budgets of the Ethics Commission, the Secretary of State's office, the Clean Election Fund, and such things as ranked choice voting. Does the Secretary of State require more funding for ranked choice voting? Many areas where we find ourselves in front of the Appropriations Committee to weigh in on the important judgments and values that are represented by how we allocate our tax funds to these different programs, and we're always there to speak out on behalf of the democracy programs, and you may be interested in doing that as well one day. And state and local government, there are a number of proceedings relating to the ethics of government and the legislature, and also the municipal administration of elections and other matters that come before state and local government. So we do have a presence there as well. Now, some of the tools to follow. There are. Let me just say there are both formal and informal ways to follow the legislative process. It's good to know about both. The formal process is that each chamber of the legislature has what's referred to as a calendar, and the calendar for the legislative body, the House, for example, can be seen online at the links that are there on the screen. The calendar for the day details all of the legislative business in sequence that is going to be coming up that day. Now, that calendar is always correct when it's published, which is usually the day before or sometimes the morning of the session, but it is continuously supplemented throughout the day, and there may be as many as 20 supplemental calendars that you have to stay up on top of to know what additional business is coming before the body during that particular day. And in addition to that, the presiding officers will often jump around within the calendar to take things in an order that's different from the way they're listed in the calendar. So it really does require paying attention and following the process either in the legislative gallery or online through online video and audio connection that the State House does provide. Now, that calendar is not to be confused with the earlier calendar, which is the session calendar, which lays out the days on which the session days are occurring, committee meetings, other events that are in the State House that relate to the legislature. The other link down there, the bill tracking tool, is a very interesting and very helpful device that you should explore when you get time. You can search for bills that are coming up in the legislature. You can search for the bills that are being proposed by your legislator. You can search for bills with a certain word in their title. You can search for bills in a previous session of the legislature, and then you can find all kinds of information, the bill text, any amendments to the bill, the fiscal note showing the cost of the bill, testimony in the public hearings, the number of public hearings that it has been given, and for bills that have already gone through the process, you can see the roll call votes, if there are any, in the House and the Senate, and how your legislator voted on the bill. So that's a very helpful tool, and it does require some familiarity, but if you take your time and get used to that, you'll find there's a tremendous amount of information there. Now, on the right side, word of mouth, the informal ways to follow legislation. There's really no substitute for having relationships and other sources of information that might give you a heads up on legislative developments before they appear in a calendar or before they can be viewed on one of these other tools, just by word of mouth, speaking to your legislator, speaking with other lobbyists and volunteers who might be up there, just being present in the State House and asking questions and keeping your ears open. You can often find out really important information that will help you in the process of following your bill of interest.
Well, we'll talk a bit more about the process of a public hearing, and the law requires that the public be given a notice of these hearings, so that folks aren't taken by surprise. As I said earlier, every bill, with a very rare exception, gets a public hearing. I can remember a bill when I was in the House which did not get a hearing. It was introduced by the governor on the last day of session, and it was to name a bridge in Skowhegan after Margaret Chase Smith. And nobody felt that needed a hearing, and it was enacted immediately. Typically, a committee will schedule multiple bills for a hearing. They will publish a list of them, but one should not assume that they will necessarily be heard in the order in which they're listed. The first folks to speak at a public hearing, once the presiding, the chair of the committee, and by the way, there are two chairs for each committee, a House and a Senate chair, because of their joint committees. The sponsors and any co-sponsors will testify first, followed by other legislators who might want to speak on a bill. Typically they don't if their name isn't on the bill, but it does happen. And they're not subject to any time limits. Then sometimes people who are there from an agency, it might be the Department of Professional and Financial Regulation speaking on a bill to license massage therapists, will want to say something. So they'll be given an opportunity. Then it's opened up to the general public. Typically, those who are there to speak in favor of a bill get to speak first, followed by those who are opposed to a bill. And then there is a category called neither for nor against. And that's, at least in theory, for people who want to provide comment or information who really haven't got a position on a bill. That category is sometimes misused a little bit, and you can tell when somebody gives testimony. In some cases, they really do have an opinion, but they somehow, for some reason, wanted to hide that. If the legislative committee expects a lot of people on a particular issue, it might be on a lobster bill or a gun bill or something else, they will implement a time limit, typically 3 minutes, and in some of these situations, the committee will also require people to sign up ahead of time, and they usually open that sign-in sheet perhaps an hour before the hearing begins, and they will call people in the order in which they signed up. Okay. You see here a picture of a committee room. This one happens to be the Committee on Appropriations and Financial Affairs, and the curved dais there is actually where the 13 members of the committee sit, often referred to as a horseshoe. In most committees, you don't see these other desks in the center, but this committee has that space because they will sometimes hear sections of a budget in conjunction with members of another committee. If, for example, they're hearing the budget on the Department of Public Safety, they will invite members of the Committee on Public Safety to come in and join them. As I said earlier, there's a Senate chair and a House chair. By protocol or tradition, at least, the Senate chair typically chairs a committee and will hand the gavel to the House chair, usually if the Senate chair has to leave for some reason. There are 11 other members of the committee, and those 11 seats are parceled out based on the size of the majority and the minority in each body. At least that's true in the House. In the Senate, it's always a static number. There is a second member from the Senate of the majority party and a single member of the Senate from the minority party. Each committee has a clerk who sort of takes care of the administrative business, such as making sure the public notices are posted, recording roll call votes in committee, and things of that sort. Then there is an analyst, and that person often may have legal training or training in public policy or history, and they provide an analysis of the legislation independent of what legislators hear from the public, and they will typically open the first work session with a review of the public hearing, reminding members of the committee who said what, and as sort of a refresher before they begin the work session. There is one rule that you don't approach members of the legislature at their desks during a hearing, but it is possible to get a message to members by, typically one would hand the clerk a note. Okay. I think I said earlier the public hearing is usually week. The notice is usually week before the public hearing. Oh, I'm sorry. We're talking work sessions now. Yeah, typically the work session follows the public hearing by about a week. Sometimes it may be faster toward the end of a session when they're trying to get business out. Sometimes it may actually be a few weeks if they're waiting for some other information to, say, come in from a state agency. The public isn't guaranteed a right to speak at a work session, but may be invited to speak, and sometimes that can be arranged. If somebody wants to be sure the committee has some additional information, it's usually possible to arrange for a member of the committee to invite that person to speak. Amendments may be offered by members of the committee, and then it comes time to vote, and there are several options. And these acronyms stand for ought to pass, ought not to pass, or ought to pass as amended. And there's no requirement that every member of the committee vote the same way, thus minority reports. So we might have some members of the committee who like the bill as drafted, and they may vote ought to pass. You may have others who would like it if there were some changes made, and so they offer an amendment, and if they vote for that amended version, that's an ought to pass as amended report. Now, usually you don't see more than 2 reports, but I've seen as many as 5. Once you get out beyond 2 reports, the chances of anything ultimately becoming a law are diminished significantly. And that's because members who are not on this committee rely on their colleagues on the Committee of Jurisdiction for some guidance in how to proceed. And if they look at a committee report that's come out split 3 or 4 ways, they say, well, if these folks can't decide what ought to happen, I can't either. I'm going to vote no. Once the committee members have cast their vote, a piece of paper referred to as a jacket is signed by all of them, and off it goes to the House of Origin, as we said earlier. Okay.
Okay, so once the bill leaves the committee, if it has no votes in the committee, if it was a unanimous vote against the bill, then the bill is essentially dead. Nothing. It goes to the Chamber of Origin, but then it is just simply disposed of, and nothing further happens with it. If it has at least 1 vote in favor of the bill, then it continues on the pathway of legislation, and it goes, as we noted, to the chamber from which it originated, meaning the chamber where the sponsor has a seat. The bill will then appear on the calendar within a few days of leaving the committee. If there is an amendment in the committee, there may be some time required for the amendment to be finalized and put into the proper legislative form, and then made available to members of the chamber. But again, at the end of the session, all of these processes are accelerated. All of the timelines and deadlines are flexible and can be waived in order to get legislation through more expeditiously. They call that suspending the rules. It takes a 2/3 vote to suspend the rules, and that happens all the time in order to ensure the smooth flow of legislation through the chambers. The bill how will we know when the bill comes up for a vote? That is a combination of following the chamber's calendar that I referred to before, and also using your informal communication methods to ask legislators to advise you and to try to notify you when a bill is scheduled to actually be debated. One important thing to note here is that during the legislative session, each morning, the presiding officer meets with his or her committee chairs and key staff and key legislators and plans out the day. This is called the chair's meeting, and it's informal, but it's important. And at that meeting, the legislators will decide which pieces of legislation that are on the calendar will be debated during that legislative day. And some will not be ready for debate. They will either be political reasons why they want to delay it, or there may be a person missing, or there may be information missing. For whatever reason, there will be bills that will stay on the calendar for day after day after day and do not get actually debated. But during the chair's meeting, they will decide a handful of bills that will actually be debated during the day. And that word goes out to all the legislators so they can prepare, obviously, to cast their vote. And if they're going to be speaking on the floor, they will prepare their floor comments. And there's a note here on parliamentary procedures. There are lengthy books about the procedures that govern this process. There are professional staff in both chambers who know the parliamentary procedures and who advise the presiding officer, but the presiding officer ultimately is the person who rules on any parliamentary questions that come up, and that ruling is subject to an override by the chamber with a 2/3 vote. So lobbying tips. Well, the most important thing I'm going to tell you today, in my opinion, is that when you go to lobby, remember that the legislators work for you. You may feel uncomfortable there. You may feel that you don't know the procedures. You may feel that you don't know your way around the building. You may feel ill at ease speaking in public. But setting all of that aside, the legislature is there for you. The legislators work for the taxpayers and the citizens and voters of the state, and it's their job to receive input from people like yourself who are concerned about an issue. So my advice is not to be intimidated, to be confident, and yet respectful of others who are in the process. But you have a right to be there, and you have a right to be heard. So the particular tips on this slide are to ask for support. If you feel like your bill is in the zone where it might or might not pass, just simply asking other legislators if they would support your bill. And if they wouldn't support it, is there an amendment that would make it more palatable for them? And of course, working with the Democracy Partnership to help talk about the bills that are coming down and the priority bills that you might want to focus on, you might want to testify about, you might want to speak to individual legislators about. And just in your own words, make your case to those legislators who you approach about a bill. No one up there is an expert except for some of the professional lobbyists. So no one can expect you to be an expert, and you're there to provide whatever opinion and whatever views and whatever information that you have from your experience as a resident of that legislative district, or as a person living in Maine, and that is legitimate, and that is all you need to bring up there. If you're asked a question, or if somebody expects you to have certain information, it's always perfectly fair and acceptable to say, I will try to find that information. I don't have it. I will try to get back to you with it. But it's really not your obligation to do the research for anybody else up there. Monitoring the committee hearing schedules and the work session schedules, of course, is important, and actually testifying when you have a priority bill that you would like to really make the case for at a public hearing. And when you're testifying, it's important to anticipate what others who might not support the bill might say about it, and to try to neutralize them by addressing those objections in your own testimony. You're advised to bring 20 printed copies of your testimony. Testimony, the public hearings can go on and on, so try to find something to make your testimony stand out. Keep it clear, factual, concise. Try to look the legislators in the eye while you're up there. Try to speak from the heart, and try to really communicate your point as succinctly as you can, and within a few minutes. They really don't like it when people go on for more than a few minutes, especially when there is a lengthy public hearing and several public hearings stretching into the evening. The patience of the legislators can, understandably reach a limit on days like that. Follow up with notes, so on. Say thank you, even appreciation for people who ask difficult questions, if they do, is always appropriate. And then at the end of the public hearing, the committee members will usually announce when the work session is, and if possible, it's a good idea to try to be there for that, even though you will just be an observer. You won't be able to actually testify again at the work session.
There are two toll-free numbers one might want to use for leaving brief messages for legislators. And typically you would say, "This is Bob Howe calling from Brunswick. Please let Senator Carson know that I think he should support LD 1702. And that's about all you'll have the opportunity to leave. But if you leave your number and or email address, you're very apt to hear back from them. I think in some ways these are more effective than emails, because we've gotten to the point with email that legislators are so flooded with them. Even less effective than a personal email is a copy and paste type of message that legislators may receive from 10 or 15 people. But we can tell when an organization is making an effort to generate voicemails, because the pages in the House and the Senate will trot into the chamber and leave these pink slips of paper on the desks. And sometimes when you see a lot of those, you know some organization is really getting the members to call. So oh, okay, it's over to Dina.
Thank you, Bob and John. This slide gives a little bit more information about the best point of contact at the Democracy Partnership in case you have any questions about testifying, advocacy, or specific ways to get involved through our organization. And you can email Sarah at the email or give her a call at the number provided on the screen, and she can easily connect you as well to John or Bob if they're more likely to have the information that you need. I'd like to begin our Q&A now. You'll see in your webinar screen a section where you can type in your questions. So please type in as many questions as you'd like. I'll read them, and Bob and John will answer them right now. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So please start typing, and we'll take it from there. Christopher asked if these slides will be made available. Yes, Christopher, these slides, there will both be a recording of this entire presentation that you'll receive by email tomorrow. And we can also provide these slides in PDF form if you'd like. So shoot me a note by just replying to the email you receive tomorrow, and I'll make sure you get a copy of the PDF presentation. We have a question. Bob, perhaps you can answer this. If a committee votes disapproval of a bill, does it still go to a floor vote in the House of Origin?
It does, yes. Every bill, every report from a committee does go to the floor. As John said earlier, if nobody on the committee supports the bill, it will die, but it does show up on the calendar, and that report has to be accepted. So some action on the floor is required.
Another person asked, do we have a Facebook group that people can join to get notified about the upcoming bills? And the answer to that, Heidi, is yes. You can follow. What I'll do is email you. I have your email address. I'll email you direct links to both Facebook groups for the League of Women Voters of Maine and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections. You'll be able to follow us on both of those to get updates. Another person, John, perhaps you can answer this, asked who has to register as a lobbyist and who does not.
Any person who is compensated for their work might have to register for a lobbyist if they work a certain number of hours in a month. So there is an hourly minimum that, 8 hours in a month of actually paid time lobbying in the legislature in order to trigger the registration requirement, and then that person needs to report for the remainder of the legislative session. So if you work as a volunteer entirely, or if you never reach 8 hours of lobbying in a session in a month, then you do not have to register with the Ethics Commission.
And that 8 hours isn't just 8 hours talking to legislators. It would include certain preparatory work that's intended to influence the outcome of a bill.
Another question we received is, what does it take to override a veto?
2/3 of the members of each body.
There we go. Someone asked, will the House Speaker and Senate President be elected on December 5th?
I believe the answer is yes.
Yeah, they will. I mean, it's pretty certain what the outcome is going to be, but it isn't formalized yet.
And Bob, how does a citizens initiative get a legislative sponsor?
Well, it doesn't have one. The sponsors are actually the people who sign a petition. And so instead of an LD number, it's given an B, yes. Initiated bill. Has no legislative sponsor on it.
It does raise a good point, though, that each bill that is proposed as a citizen initiative does, before it goes out to the voters, it does come to the legislature and go through the legislative process. Now, it may be a full legislative process with a public hearing and votes in both chambers, or it may be a truncated process, as has happened in recent years. But under the Constitution, the legislature is allowed a chance to weigh in on the bill before it goes out to the voters.
But it can't block it.
That's correct. Yeah.
It's not unusual for the legislature not to conduct a public hearing on these. In fact, I think on the second clean elections referendum, correct me if I'm mistaken, I think the legislature moved quickly to indefinitely postpone it, which has the effect of sending it to the voters without any further action at the State House.
Yes, in about the last 7 or 8 years, there's been a trend towards the legislature just indefinitely postponing citizen initiatives so they don't get public hearings. That's happened sometimes, but not in each case.
John, what's a placeholder bill and how is it used?
I believe you might be referring to a bill that's a bill in title only. When a legislator proposes a concept, that they would like to have considered as a bill in the legislature, but they've just been elected and they haven't had the time to write out the full bill or have somebody else help them with it. They may just put in a concept bill, which may just be a few sentences laying out the idea that they have, and that I think is what it's being referred to as a placeholder bill, which gets a official place in the process, so that there is a date called the cloture date, which is the last date where legislators can't submit legislation. So if you get a concept bill or a placeholder bill in before the cloture date, then you have a vehicle to discuss your idea later on in the session. If you don't do that, it may be quite difficult to get your idea in front of the legislative committee because cloture is passed and you don't have an opportunity to put a bill in.
Except with permission of a majority of the members of leadership.
Bob, this is a good question. It kind of tees us up to talk about our next webinar on grassroots communications. But Carrie just wrote and said, one of you said that it's clear when an organization has encouraged their members to contact legislators because lots of notes arrive during the discussion. Does that mean that this is or isn't effective? Please explain. And what's the best route?
Well, I think the least effective is probably cut and paste emails. Excuse me. If a legislator gets 6 or 8, 10, 20 emails that all read the same, that's a couple things about that. For one thing, the sender has not had to put in a lot of thought into sending that message. And so I don't think it has not nearly the credibility as one that's obviously individually crafted. I also think somebody who takes the time to pick up the phone and either leave a message on one of those 800 lines or call a legislator at home, which is perfectly acceptable, and their home phone numbers for the most part are listed if you can find the right page on the website. That's more effective. Above all of those methods, coming to the State House is perhaps the most effective. And some people, and I will encourage some client organizations to have their members get to know legislators after the election before it's time to ask them for anything, to try to meet them in the districts. I'm hoping I'm answering the question.
They'll be able to write for more clarity if it didn't quite do it. Another question, when wandering the halls of the State House, how do you identify legislators as opposed to lobbyists or other citizens?
Well, let me answer that. I'll try to take that question. There are two things I would say. One is that most legislators wear a lapel badge, or a pin of some kind, identifying themselves and their district. And they will be, walking freely in and out of the chambers so that, there will be a steady stream of them. You kind of get a sense of which ones are the legislators and which ones are just standing there as lobbyists. The other thing you can do is to consult one of the resources. There are different registers, handbooks, and in some cases, small, almost like posters that have photographs of the legislators, and you can familiarize yourself with the legislators that way. Unfortunately, those don't come out until well into the legislative session. So the first few weeks of the session, you're kind of left to look at their lapel badge or just simply ask somebody.
There is one publication that I think usually comes out before that register, and I call that the roadmap. It folds out like a highway map, and it's a configuration of the layout of the floor of the House and the Senate with pictures of the legislators and their names on them. No other biographical information, but that's usually published earlier than that register.
And this is an interesting follow-up question to the question about calling legislators. Is there a public tally published about how many of those calls come through for and against a bill?
Well, there's not. The short answer is there's not. Some legislators will announce their own tallies, but that is not something that is tracked publicly.
What is tracked publicly is testimony at the public hearings, at least to the extent that people submit a written statement. And those written statements now get posted on the website for each individual legislative document in PDF form. So you can find out a day or two after the public hearing who submitted testimony and whether it was for or against the bill.
Can IBs be followed in the same way as LDs?
Yeah, I think that's right, John. Assuming
yes, they can. If they go through the legislative process. Is that if you're referring to the legislative process? Yes, in the actual legislature itself. After they leave the legislature at the end of the session, if they are heading to the ballot box, in the following election, then there's no other way to follow that process.
Here's an interesting question about clerks. This person would like a little more information about them, whether they're professional, nonpartisan staffers, whether they have a length of time that they serve, and are the pages that run around on the floor and deliver messages, are they regular staffers, the same person, or do they change very often?
Well, let's take the clerks. The clerks are hired by, I guess technically by the presiding officers. Chairs of committees often have much to say about who serves as a clerk, and they are sometimes, frankly, partisan patronage jobs to some extent, although I think they do look to see that people have basic qualifications, administrative skills. But the analysts, on the other hand, it's a very different matter. These people are strictly professional, nonpartisan staff members and work out of a separate office called the Office of Policy and Legal Analysis. And there's another one called the Office of Policy and Office of Fiscal and Program Review. That's another strictly nonpartisan professional office. And those people, many of them make careers of those positions, whereas the clerks tend to come and go. There are some committees who have clerks that come back year after year, but those are mostly seasonal jobs. And when the legislature goes home, the clerk position typically ends. Oh, the pages. There are also pages who are on the legislative staff. I think they are assigned, I think they report to the either the clerk of the House or the Secretary of Senate. But there are also volunteer pages, usually school kids that go up for the day, as my kids did when I was a legislator, and John's probably did too.
I think we have time for one more question. Tom asks, in recent legislative sessions, some bills seem to have had very short notices of public hearings. Why does that happen?
Well, that is a good question. There are rules that require a minimum number of days for public hearing. I believe it was 2 weeks previously, but as they approach the end of the legislative session, there is a tremendous amount of pressure to finish their work on time without delaying their adjournment. And as a result, everything gets compressed, and sometimes bills do not get the full advance public notice of a public hearing, which is regrettable. And we do ask our legislators to provide as much notice as possible so that people can be prepared to be there and testify. But sometimes they truncate that time period.
Well, and that sometimes is another reason why there's very short notice. A governor can put a bill in any time, such as the bill to name the bridge many years ago after Margaret J. Smith. But Governor LePage has had a habit of submitting a lot of very substantive governor's bills, sometimes in the waning days of the session. And if they get a hearing at all, it's usually with very short notice.
So this concludes our webinar. Thanks again, Bob and John. To everyone who's listening, you're going to receive an email in the next 24 hours that will ask you to answer about 3 or 4 questions about this webinar. Your feedback's really helpful in making sure that future webinars give you the information you're really interested in receiving. As a reminder, on December 17th, We'll be producing our next webinar, which is focused on grassroots communications. You'll be able to sign up on any of our social media channels or our websites starting today or tomorrow if you're interested in joining. And we would love to hear from you at any of the modes of communication we've talked about today and answer your questions if they didn't get answered in this webinar this evening. So thank you again. Thanks, Bob and John. Any final thoughts?
No, thank you, and good luck with the lobbying. It's important work.
And we hope to see you at the State House. Let us know if you're coming.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.